Hello, I'm Rory McKiernan and welcome to the Love and Courage podcast. Love and Courage is independent community-supported media for social change. Thanks to all of you who have been spreading the word and to the fantastic donors and patrons who chip in on an ongoing basis to put fuel in the Love and Courage fire. Together we've helped the podcast hit the number one spot on iTunes and reach and inspire people all over the world as part of a real community for change. A special mention for my friends at Include who offer discounted software and technology consultancy for non-profits in Ireland and internationally. See more at enclude.ie, that's enclude.ie. Also, special thanks to monthly patrons Simon Ward, Dara Doyle, Ronan Brannigan, Megan Brown, Darren Ryan, Sophia Duffy, Davy Ward, Eamon Stack, Anne Keenahan, Stephen Kelleher, Ruth McKenna, Niall Doherty, Dermot Kirsten and Ray McGee, and to all who've chipped in on a once-off basis also. You can find out more about the podcast, send me feedback, inquire about Love and Courage talks, workshops and events, sign up for newsletter updates and make a financial contribution, however small, at loveandcourage.org, and on Twitter it's at loveandcourage. Thanks again for all your support. It really is appreciated. Enjoy the podcast.
We know that we can achieve these goals, make sure that not just we have rights, but other people have rights, or at least have the opportunity to have rights. If we persevere, if we have courage, that we can do this. And people have done it, And that's the great lesson of all these paintings too. People have done this. We have succeeded in getting more civil rights, in ending Jim Crow, in ending lynching, and in giving workers' rights, in ending child labor, and giving women's rights. These things all happen. And they happened not easily, but with struggle by people who understood that they would have no rights unless they claimed them. Helen Keller understood that. We all can understand that. If we understand that deeply enough, we can transform this world.
My guest in this episode is Robert Shetterly. Robert is an acclaimed artist and draft resister who risked prison for his conscientious objection to the Vietnam War. Born in Cincinnati, Ohio in 1946, Robert is best known for his portrait series, Americans Who Tell the Truth, which he began as a personal response to the US war against Iraq. He has painted hundreds of Americans who he sees as beacons for truth, people like Amy Goodman, Edward Snowden, Joanna Macy, Noam Chomsky, and the great Pete Seeger. Robert has travelled the world as part of the Americans Who Tell the Truth project, and he has now started a non-profit organisation that encourages students to explore models of courageous citizenship. I met Robert at the World Fellowship Centre, a renowned social justice retreat and conference centre in New Hampshire that was founded in 1941 as a place of sanctuary and recreation for people of all religions and races. Robert, who now lives in Maine, shared his fascinating life story with me, including the incredible stories of the pressures he faced resisting the Vietnam War, the death threats he received as a young teacher in rural West Virginia, his decision to join the Back to the Land movement, and how he became a self-taught artist. Robert spends his time highlighting the courage of others, and it was a privilege for me to make time to highlight his courageous journey. This was a fascinating conversation with the warm, wise and gentle soul that is Robert Shetterly. Robert, thanks so much for joining me on the Love and Courage podcast. We find ourselves here in the World Fellowship Centre, and I'd love to start if you could tell me about how you found yourself here and what your relationship with the centre is and how far it goes back.
I came here the first time, I think it was maybe 7 or 8 years ago. A friend of mine from Maine, my best buddy, a man named Dud Hendrick, called me up one day and said, I hear Noam Chomsky speaking at the World Fellowship Center in New Hampshire. I had never actually, I had read Noam Chomsky and I'd actually painted his portrait as part of the work I do, which I'd done from photographs, but I had not met him. And I'd idolized him. And that's quite a hike for us from the coast of Maine. It was about a 4.5 or 5 hour drive to get here to hear Chomsky. And so we came to this place that turned out to be a little funkier than I expected. And they had cleaned out the dining hall to allow for as many people as would be here to hear him. And just as in a kind of tribute, homage to him, I brought my portrait of him to hang up during the time that he was here. And Andy Davis, who was the head of it then, saw the portrait and suggested that maybe the next year I would bring back some more portraits, and they would actually put them up. And that's the way it happened then. I mean, I afterwards, the next year they did it, invite me to come with 6 or 10 portraits and hang them up for the summer, and then come back myself and give some talks here. And it's become a regular thing, and it's become also a very important part of my summer. I mean, well, like a lot of people, I imagine, to do the kind of thing I do, you never know when to stop. You just, there's always this feeling like I could be doing more. If I only did a little bit more, maybe things would actually change. And so I come here and I stop for a bit. I mean, it's fun to meet all the amazing people you meet here and give a few talks, but really just to go down to the pond and kayak around or go on hikes with various people you meet and relax. It's a significant and important thing to do.
Have you always struggled with that, with the need to relax, and have you always been a go all your life?
I think I have been a go person, but it came right out of my childhood. My father, who was a man of some integrity, was also a man who told his children that what counted in your life was, not the grade you got, but the effort you put in. And so everything was based on effort. And I, from a very early age, began to try to live that way. In school, I worked hard to get good grades, and then I, tried to work really hard to be a good athlete and do everything that was expected of me. It was a number of years before I realized that the only problem with that is I hadn't taken any time to get to know who I was. I was doing what other people wanted me to do and working very hard at it. And I began to understand that I had to be doing other things in order to find out who I was, but I never let go of the sense of how important it was to work hard. And so there's that nagging Puritan ethic in me which says, work harder. And the truth is, I think I enjoy working hard. I mean, I enjoy taking the time to try to make something of value by working hard on it. I mean, that's the real thing. It isn't just for the sake of working hard. It's for the sake of making something of value, whether it's in a relationship or it's, a painting or a poem or whatever it is, to really put in the time.
And you mentioned that idea of getting to know yourself. Around what age did you start to develop an awareness of that?
That happened in high school, I think. There was a period when I had been going through all these motions and achieving. I also lived in a kind of family where you received love based on achievement, not just who you were. And I started to read a lot of literature. I wasn't interested in art at that time. It was all literature. I read poetry and novels and things, and was beginning to get the sense that there was a lot more to life and other people and myself than I had any idea of. And I started to write myself. And I think it was through writing poetry that I began to find a voice, or at least a way of looking inward, which I hadn't done before. It was all looking outward and modeling myself on other people's expectations. And now I was beginning to look at myself, and I could, through that process, I could face my own insecurities, my own questions, my own confusions about who I might be and what I might want to really do. And then some very personal things happened in high school where there were some really exceptionally brilliant kids in my school who I noticed that the teachers were insecure with. They didn't. They were too smart for them, and I think they put the teachers on the defensive, and they often participated in a kind of heckling of these kids. And I thought, wow, I think I need to take a stand with those boys who were so vulnerable, really. I mean, they were not the kind of kids who knew how to stand up for themselves. And by doing that, I separated myself out from the group that had been my peer group. In the process of that, I understood that I had not just the ability to explore myself, but by acting a certain way in the world, by choosing sides sometimes, that I could have a significant effect on the way other people might be treated. But I could also, but I was defining myself by doing that in ways that I had not anticipated at all. Just a simple action of standing up for a couple of kids who I admired and thought were being mistreated. I had defined myself and to myself in a way that I was surprised by. And but what happens is you do one thing like that, and then you realize, well, there are 100 other things I could be doing. And then each one of those kinds of actions gives you permission to begin to act differently in other aspects of your life. And I think it's that giving of permission, which is the real lesson that I learned at that time.
Yeah, it strikes me that there was almost an awakening to a moral code or a sense of right or wrong there. Was that something that also ran through your family, a sense of justice?
It was. My family were, my father was a corporate executive. But today you would say that, and well, probably then too if you wanted to, but that would be highly suspect in terms of moral code. But he was a man of great integrity. And I remember when he was still alive in the 1990s, when the celebrity salary was really getting rolling in the corporate world, people paying themselves huge amounts of money and then huge bonuses and, becoming multi-millionaires. He was appalled. His sense of being a corporate, a fairly well-paid corporate person was mostly the responsibility that entailed. How much you then had to give back to your community because you'd been privileged to receive that kind of payment for what you did. And I was very moved by that. He was, as I mentioned earlier, he was a lot about working hard, but he was also about working hard with a set of values that justified your success.
So I'm imagining this young Robert with his poetry book in hand, and was he part of an emerging Beatnik generation, or were you part of a wider movement, do you think, around that time?
I don't really know to what extent it was part of something else. At the time it was very, very personal. I wasn't aware of a lot of the movements going on in this country. I grew up in just outside of Cincinnati in southern Ohio. I wasn't really aware of the Beatniks. I wasn't aware of I don't think I was very aware of the beginning of the Vietnam War and the protests that became actually a huge part of my life shortly after that. But at this point in high school, I was mostly aware of personal achievement in school and playing sports and meeting girls, and then starting to open up a sensitive side of myself by writing poetry. Things changed a lot, though, for me. And I graduated from high school in 1965. My older brother, was already in college, and he was... in 1964, he went to Mississippi as part of the Freedom Summer. That was a shock to me. I didn't know what this was all about. And I was stunned to see the uproar that happened in our house and in our community because of his doing that. And that was a huge awakening for me. He, for him to try to explain what was going on in the world and what was going on in Mississippi and why he needed to be part of that, and then the discussions we had around American history and race and what our responsibility was to get involved. That opened my ideas much more than, myself as a potentially young poet, was myself as a person inheriting a legacy of racism in this country, and as a white person having some responsibility to become involved.
And from there, did you go on to university or college?
I did. I left Cincinnati in 1965 and went to Harvard, and and immediately began to be involved in both civil rights work and then probably a year or two later in anti-Vietnam or peace work. And so it was, as much as I was engaged in studying and having that whole world open up for me of that kind of intellectual world, which was not really so much a part of my upbringing and was very exciting, was also getting engaged in the big movements of the time. I mean, those were the movements that defined that generation. I mean, it's interesting to me that, the way the 60s are now talked about, and were shortly after that talked about as though this were an era of irresponsibility, in a way, of the hippies and the drugs and the counterculture, and it didn't seem like that to me. I mean, to me it was, and the people that I was around, even though obviously there were a lot of hippies but the way that they defined themselves to me was really taking responsibility for what the world was at that time and trying to change it, and being much more open emotionally and physically and spiritually to what the possibilities of being a human might be, were a huge part of that. But that wasn't hedonistic, it wasn't irresponsible, it didn't seem to me. It was actually trying to discover what the responsibility of each of us is as a human being to become a full human being. And I don't think that we really solve the problems in the world if we haven't tried to understand what that is. I mean, it's like the first duty of a teacher should be to help each student become the person that student could be, not in terms of becoming a gear in the globalized economy, but you'll be a successful person, a successful citizen, a successful anything you do, the more deeply you know your own self. And that should be the first tenet of education, is help the kids become themselves, discover who they really are. And that's what, in a way, that seemed to be one of the things that was really taking place in the 60s, and was so important, was people who had come out of these actually very conformist and repressive culture, just trying to discover, well, who the hell really are we? What does it mean to be a human being? What does it mean to be in relationship with other people and with the environment? How do we then act? We were inventing that, which doesn't, as I said, it doesn't mean being irresponsible. It means exploration. And that had to happen. And it was coupled with, that exploration was coupled with all this awareness of social justice and how one needed to act in relationship to other people.
How much of that do you think was a reaction to Vietnam?
Well, it was a huge part, and Vietnam was, this cloud that kept getting darker and darker, and more and more oppressive. I felt, because of, I was a student, and I don't know how many people remember the history exactly, but if you were a student in the United States during those years, you got what was called a 2S deferment. You didn't have to go fight. And as long as you could stay in school, you could stay out of it. That seemed to me a totally immoral privilege. I mean, if a country gets to the place where people are having to, not just risk their lives, but risk taking on the burden of killing other human beings for the protection of your society, which is the way it has to be framed. If you're doing that, why in the world should it only be, poor people or people who can't afford to go to school or, dropouts or whatever it is, that have to bear that burden? This should be a burden that everyone takes on equally, or it's corrupt, it's immoral. And I thought that I couldn't abide having that deferment. It also turned out that I was, the more I thought about it, the more, and studied it, the more opposed I was to the war itself. I mean, it wasn't just a question of having a deferment while other people fought. It was a question of them fighting in a war that shouldn't have ever been fought. There was a war of imperialism. And a war of, a kind of geopolitical game that nobody should be dying in. So I turned in my draft card and thought I would go to jail because of it. It meant that much to me. I just couldn't live with myself otherwise, being in that kind of privileged situation.
Do you remember the moment receiving your draft card?
Well, I remember I was still in high school when I got my draft card, and it didn't actually, at that moment, I don't think I was, the world of Vietnam and where it might take me or what it might ask of me didn't seem, it wasn't present. It was just a thing that 18-year-olds did. You got this card. And it was almost like a rite of passage, You accepted it as, now I'm potentially grown up in a certain sense. It wasn't until I got in college and started really realizing this was about me and it was about a war, and I had this was an opportunity to take a stand or not about how I was going to respond to having that card. That was the thing that became aware of as it went along.
Did you have friends or family that went to Vietnam?
In college, I knew people who went, and I didn't have family who went. That was, but it was so omnipresent. I mean, there were people all around, whether I knew them well or not, who were making these choices, and it was the topic of conversation constantly amongst people. How are you going to deal with this? And people were making all kinds of decisions for all kinds of reasons. Some people, it was only, why should I let this war interrupt my life? Why don't I go to Canada, and get away from this? It wasn't so much that it was might be a bad war or an unnecessary war, an immoral or illegal war. It was that I don't want this to to have that control over me, or and then people were doing things like getting a doctor to say that they're mentally unstable or they've got some injury that will make them. That seemed a bad way out. I mean, this was a war that, it was a situation where you had to face it squarely. You had the decision had to be ethical rather than escapist. And that's what I felt that the only way to respond to it was to do something like what I did, either go or resist, or, you had to make those kinds of choices. Anything else was morally sloppy, I thought.
And you did so with the awareness and understanding that could end up in prison.
I did, yeah. It seemed, I certainly had no idea of what that might be like for me, up to 5 years in prison, which was with the penalty for resisting the draft. But it seemed like if this war was going to be stopped, it was going to have to be, not because poor people were refusing, but because privileged people were refusing. That's where the the greatest pressure would come down on the government, I thought, was when families like mine got upset about it and said, say my father would say, my son's in prison, you've got to stop this war.
So what happened next? Did you end up in prison, or what?
No, it was interesting. One of the worst days of my life ever was when because as soon as you turn in your draft card, you get classified 1A, which means they'll take you anytime. And then I was called for induction, and I went to the Boston Navy shipyard for the induction one day, at 5 o'clock in the morning, whenever they did it. These busloads of kids would come in and go through the physicals and everything. And the last thing you do at the physical is have to sign a loyalty oath. And I refused to sign it. And everybody else went home, and I was the only one that day that refused that. And I was not emotionally prepared for what this was going to be like. I had no idea. I just knew I was going to do it. And so then they kept me for hours, grilling me with these Army, Navy intelligence people, alone in a room being asked all these questions about, well, who put you up to this? Why are you doing this?
You're in your early 20s at this stage?
No, I was, maybe 19 or 20 maybe. I was not, one is I for some reason, just physically, and it was probably the stress, I had an intense headache. I felt awful. And it just went on and on and on. They just kept asking these questions, and it was an interrogation. And I was exhausted by it, but I just was straight with them. I had, nobody had put me up to it and all that kind of stuff. It was just, but it was exhausting. And then a few days later, the FBI came to my college dorm room. 2 agents came to interview me and ask me the same kinds of questions. Suddenly you take a step like that and you suddenly realize of the power of the state to come down on you pretty hard and turn up a certain kind of pressure that is very easy at some point to say, okay, I'll do what you want. Just stop doing this to me, And it was created enormous consternation around me, with other people that I knew, my roommates, my friends. A lot of people wanted to know what was really going on here and why was I doing this. And the school newspaper did an article about it and stuff. And I was. But it's funny. It's one of those things which is often I think the way people get through certain kinds of events where they have taken a stand. If you've done the first action, if you can just hang on, other things will then fall in place, and you can get through it. It's making that first decision, which is the hardest one. I'm going to do this. I'm going to turn in the draft card. I'd gone down to Yale. William Sloane Coffin was speaking, encouraging people to turn in draft cards. I had turned mine in. There are hundreds of kids there doing it. At the moment you do that, you're with a lot of people. There's a certain strength and power in that. But all of a sudden, later, when you've done it, you're totally isolated, and it's all on you, and asking you to respond in a way you have never expected to be dealt with. So it was fascinating and very hard for a while, and then nothing happened. I exchanged letters frequently with my draft board and kept them up to date. I kept trying to send them stuff about the war and why I didn't want to go and what was wrong with it and why no one should go and all that stuff. And they ignored me, and I kept sending them. So I was just trying to slow it down. I was in no hurry to get into jail. I just wanted to resist. And then I was graduating from college and nothing had happened, so I went down to West Virginia with I got married right out of college. We went to West Virginia, taught school in little mountain schools, and then the lottery came. I don't know if you remember, or anybody remembers, that one of the ways that they dealt with the draft towards the end of the war was to give people lottery numbers. And if you had a low lottery number, you could be drafted. If you had a high lottery number, chances are you wouldn't be. I was given a high number, but it wouldn't have made any difference because I was delinquent anyway. But then they didn't come after me. I don't know why. I mean, it was strange. The whole thing was strange, and but I was, I was not going to commit myself if they were not going to get me. If they're not coming, fine, And I went on with my life.
Can you tell me about your life in that rural school in West Virginia? And you say you were married at the time as well. What was life like?
West Virginia in 1969 and 70, rural, mountainous West Virginia, in southern West Virginia where I was. There was I think after a couple of months there, I thought that everything else in my life up to this point in terms of education had been irrelevant. That I was finally up against a kind of cultural and physical reality which was going to teach me lessons about life and who I was, and also how I could be in what I could be doing in a situation that I would have learned in no other way. I mean, whether I was growing up in Ohio or in Cambridge and going to school, compared to the life of people living in the mountains in West Virginia, it seemed unreal, totally unreal. These were, the people I was involved with were what are, often called hillbillies. These are Anglo-Saxon people, a lot of them Scots-Irish, been there for a long time, often very, very poor, having all kinds of, family and job, and there's enormous problems there, and also a fascinating culture. But my wife and I, coming from Cambridge, we had no idea what we were getting into, in a sense. I mean, we thought that it was a good idea to go up into this area and then live with the people we were teaching, where we got these jobs. And so we lived in a little shack up in the mountains. What we didn't realize is people in the communities around us, the more well-to-do people, thought that was really suspicious. Why would people with good educations come to places like that and live with a bunch of hillbillies and teach them in school? And the only explanation they had was, well, you had to be a communist. And so even though we were trying to be as apolitical as possible, I had short hair, I shaved off my beard, said nothing about politics, and just spent time with kids and their parents. What we didn't realize at the local revival meetings and stuff, they were very shortly preaching that somebody ought to do something about the commies up in the hills. And that was us. And it wasn't, we hadn't been there too long when we started getting death threats, and which escalated to a point after a year that our neighbors said that we were, it was unsafe for us to be there. And it happened. I mean, people came to the house with guns, and, which was a very curious confrontation, which we survived. But anyway, it was, that kind of thing was going on there all the time, but it was so, do you know the books of Cormac McCarthy by any chance?
Yeah.
Some of his early books are set in places like where we were, where there's this intense mixture of religiosity, superstition, violence, and ignorance, but machismo too. I mean, and it's a very curious and volatile mix of and very hard for somebody who likes to think of himself as a rationalist to get into and understand what the thoughts patterns are. And people are often talking to you in ways in a kind of language that to you is coded. You don't really get what they're saying or what their intentions are. And it took us a long time we never cracked the code in a way, but we did understand that it was happening after a while, that there was a kind of communication going on which we couldn't read, that was going to come down heavily on us in that situation. And it was fascinating. I remember that time of my life intensely, almost day by day, much more than almost anything that's happened since then, because it was so startlingly new to me. And there isn't time now to, talk about all the details of that, but it was a fascinating time.
And from there, did you stay in the world of education? It sounds like you had...
No, what I didn't tell you in all this was that coming out of college, I had gotten to this point where amongst all the other things, the civil rights and the Vietnam and everything, what I really wanted to do was be a visual artist. I had studied English literature and thought I was going to write and teach. Now what I wanted to do was draw and paint. And I also thought that acting in the world, like this teaching in West Virginia, was an important thing to do. But I was also, when I had the energy in between the teaching and the things that we were doing, I was starting to draw and paint. In 1970, we left West Virginia and moved to Maine because we liked being in the country now. Just didn't like the political climate of the South. And we moved. I did 11 years of the Back to the Land movement in Maine, living off the grid, raising my 2 kids, building gardens, building a house, cutting wood, digging clams on the Maine coast to survive, and by kerosene light at night, teaching myself how to draw. And that became my central passion for years, was teaching. What I discovered was that the way into myself was no longer through words, it was through images. And I was fascinated with learning the discipline, which I didn't seem to have any real aptitude for. It wasn't like I was a natural artist. The discipline of looking out at the world and then trying to reproduce it with some aesthetic quality with lines at first, just lines, no color, just lines. I loved drawing. And that took years to get to a place where I thought I was actually sufficient enough and had developed enough skill to try to become at least somewhat professional with it. And I began by illustrating for little farm and garden books, drawing pigs and chickens and broccoli. But it was a way to develop a language, like you would develop, enlarge your vocabulary to be a poet. I was developing a visual language that eventually would allow me to explore who I was as a person through images.
I'm curious about the back to the land aspect, particularly in the context of talking to friends in New York or Boston and also back home in Dublin. It's now at the point where it's almost become impossible for many people to live in a city or an urban environment without a lot of hardship, mental stress, and yet we have these vast swathes of land, particularly in Ireland, that are unoccupied and rural depopulation, which I know is also happening still in parts of Maine. Do you think that notion of back to the land as it was as a movement could become more relevant again today? And what was involved in that journey?
Definitely, it's already becoming more relevant in Maine. There was a period there where there was this wave of people who came in the late 60s and 70s into Maine. I wasn't even aware of that. And for us, it wasn't that we were necessarily fleeing urban life. We thought we were doing the logical political step in a way. That one of the things that was the problem with civil rights, and the problem particularly more with Vietnam, and the problem with the American political structure, was that it was something essentially unreal, it was unrelated to nature. And that reestablishing a relationship with nature was a very political thing to be doing. And so it wasn't just because I thought that I would really like the taste of a carrot better if it came out of my own garden. This was a statement to make. Like resisting the draft had been a statement. Going back to the land was a statement. It was also for me a thing about discovering what's real. I mean, you can grow up in a middle class environment, probably anywhere in the world, and if you really look at it, you feel there's something slightly unreal about this. I don't know what it really takes to survive in the world. Here we live in this little tiny speck in the cosmos, and shouldn't we know get as close as we can to reality as we can? What is it where the rubber meets the road? It's, well, how do you put a roof over your own head? I mean, how do you take care of your essential needs yourself? Grow your own food, cut your own wood, put a roof over your head and your family, and care for yourself in the world. I mean, and it's can be very exhilarating as well as stressful as you go through that process. What's interesting to me, because that came as a wave and then it sort of petered out. I mean, a lot of those people stayed and became very important in local cultures, and a lot of them sort of moved out of that lifestyle. At least where I live in Maine now, it's all coming back again with a different intent, though. I mean, people are coming back not just as isolated individuals trying to get in some closer relationship with nature, but they're coming as whole communities of young people who have skills, and they're building these, what we used to call communes, except they're much better at it than I think we were in the 60s or 70s, because they have professions. In the town I live in, there's a group of young people who are making some of the best bread in the world. And they're also musicians, and they also don't allow drugs, and they are very focused about the way they shape their lives, the way they interact with the larger community, the fact that they take responsibility for making enough money to care for their basic needs, and then they do all this cultural stuff in the larger community, really integrating into the full community rather than isolating themselves from it. It's another way to do this that I think a lot of people didn't recognize in the 60s or the 70s. And so it's very exciting to see that. What's interesting, I think, in relationship to your question, though, is, vast parts of the United States now, this could be done in the Midwest, say, where property values, unlike in the cities and the coasts, have actually gone down, where jobs have left and communities are kind of desolate often. They really need people to come in and reinvent what it means to be a community, reinvent what it means to be local, the way we, the kinds of things that young people can do in a community outside large systems that we have developed for the ways we live, the food systems, the transportation systems, the educational systems, the financial systems, Some of these are very hard to fight against and to interrupt their size and power. Food, though, is one that, anybody can take control of. If you are imaginative and willing to work hard, you can actually, change that system. And when you change the way we eat and the way we grow our food and the way we interact around it, you can change a whole lot about the culture and the way and their politics. And I think that's something that could be happening on a much larger scale, and probably will happen, but we'll see.
So your resistance to war and your opposition to war didn't end with Vietnam, and nor did the American wars end with Vietnam. And I know that the Iraq war in particular spurred you into action, and that's where your rubber hits the road in relation to your anti-war position and your painting came together in what is now your current project. Can you talk to me about that?
Definitely. In that gap between the back to the land, Vietnam, and what I do now, I gradually developed a voice as a surrealist printmaker and painter, and actually got to a point where I could support myself and a family making art. And I also thought I was doing... I think a lot of people, we don't often think, or we're not asked to think, well, whatever profession you choose, well, what's the cultural significance of that? What is the communal significance? What are the ethics of, for instance, of being a plumber in a society, or being an electrician, or being a teacher? What's that mean about what is being asked of you in relationship to other people because of the profession you choose? It's certainly not asked about what for many artists. Well, who are you in relationship to society because you choose to be an artist? Are you just the outcast who assumes the freedom to make pictures while other people, work 8-hour days? For me, it was always important to think about that, well, what is the role I'm playing as I'm making these pictures about mystery and ambiguity? And I thought, well, what I'm doing is I'm challenging people to go deeper into their own lives, to use their imaginations and their experience to ask some fundamental questions about who we are as human beings. That was really the primary motive behind what I was referring to as surrealism, was not just to be irresponsibly dreamlike, but to ask significant questions and use that as the method of getting there. To me, it was like visual poetry and asking serious questions. In the run-up to the Iraq War, right after 9/11, that all changed for me. It was plain to me, as it should have been to a lot of people, that the government was lying and the media was going along with it. And that it was a crisis for me. I thought either I respond to this with the thing that I do best, which is making images, or I should probably leave this country because I can't stand being here and be alienated and voiceless at this moment. I've got to respond in some way. I didn't know what to do, though. I was filled with rage. I was filled with grief for all the victims there were going to be. It was a hard time for me, but it took me several months to come up with something which was really very simple, that I would respond in terms of art by surrounding myself with people I admired from this culture, rather than feel further isolated by just ranting through my art about what was wrong, that these were lying, that the policies were immoral, blah, 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 that instead I had to use that energy of all that anger and grief to do something positive. And what that turned out to be was painting, by painting portraits of people I admired, sort of actually reattaching myself to the best of this country and its history, rather than feeling totally alienated from it. And I wanted to paint the people who had insisted, and it's been, an enormous struggle, and it continues, that the country live up to its professed ideals rather than, live up to the myth of itself, because the myth of itself is a very dangerous thing. It's full of, we call ourselves a democracy, but the myth of ourselves is all about exceptionality, and the two things are oil and water. They don't mix, but we keep pretending they do. We are an exceptional people. We believe in democracy. Not true. And unfortunately, we are controlled by people who, or the government is controlled, the politics are controlled, the corporations are controlled by people who believe in that kind of entitlement, which is anathema to the idea of a democratic republic.
So can you tell me about how the project has evolved so far, Robert, and perhaps some of the people that you've met and painted along the way?
Sure. I had a little epiphany one day that and it really struck me. Didn't know where exactly it came from, but it was the answer to what I was looking for in terms of a way to use my the energy of my anger and grief. And it was that I would paint 50 portraits. I had never painted a portrait at this point. I would paint 50 portraits. I would call them Americans Who Tell the Truth, and then I would give them away. And that last part was, I don't know why. That just suddenly happened. I just said it to myself. I'm going to give it all away. And I think I had a premonition that the people I would paint would be people who had given, so much of their lives, sometimes often their lives, to the ideals of this country, and freely. They were not being paid to do it, and they would, and that so whatever I did as an artist had to be a metaphor for the lives of those people. So if I was going to paint Frederick Douglass, I couldn't sell Frederick Douglass, which is, you understand the irony of that. Here's a man who's a slave. If I was going to paint Susan B. Anthony or Mother Jones or Jane Addams, I couldn't sell these people. I couldn't make their images and sell them. I would have to give them away. And just the idea that I would embark on a project that I actually had no idea how long it would go or whether I would actually do it or not, but that it would suddenly separate myself from the commerciality around art made me feel free for the first time in my life, totally free. Even though I had tried to be free as a surrealist. Now I thought I can say whatever I want, I can make the pictures I want to, and but no matter what happens, I will be free. And I set out to do that. I painted Frederick Douglass. I painted Sojourner Truth. I painted Harriet Tubman. I painted all the women from the women's movement in the 19th century and the labor leaders. And it was all, I began in the 19th century in sort of iconic figures in American history. Although when you go into the schools and the media, you find out that people know very little about these people. Even though they may know the names, they have no idea what they were really up against, what kind of courage they had, how they were treated, what their struggles were, and how much their own lives today depend on what those people did. We're not taught that. And we're not taught to even remember that at all. It was fascinating to me what I was learning. I was just astounded at the lives of these folks, because I was reading biographies and history and interviews, and suddenly felt I was on a vertical learning curve in terms of history and citizenship and responsibility and power. So much of it is about power. Who has the power? How do you get power? What is the relationship of money to power? Why is there so much resistance to people living out the ideals that we claim that we all embrace? And gradually, after a couple of years of doing this pretty much in isolation, people started to take notice. And by then I was actually moving up into the early 20th century, and I was collecting portrait after portrait after portrait. Sometime, I think the first couple of years I painted more than 20 a year, and also doing all the research around the history and the biography. And then people started asking me to talk. I never expected it. I just thought I was doing this thing that was important to me, but I didn't realize the educational potential of it. And then I started being asked to talk in schools and talk to community groups and talk in libraries. And that the project began to blossom. And we formed a nonprofit so that we could accept donations to keep the project going. And then people were asking me I want to show the pictures in Ohio, and I live in the coast of Maine, so it means shipping paintings. It was expensive, and how do you afford to do all that? So we need to start to raise money. It's interesting how things like that suddenly develop, and what becomes is a very personal statement and important therapeutic process for myself, all then becomes an educational project. And I think it's partly because what was going on in me was going on in millions of other people. What is this country? How do we live here? Who are the people we should really be listening to at this time? Should we be listening, to Howard Zinn more than George Bush. And each painting, though, I knew had, besides the importance of the portrait, what I did to make it very pointed was I scratched a quote from that person into the surface of the painting. And that was a key part of the idea of Americans Who Tell the Truth, is that these quotes, I thought, were particular truths about who we have been, who we are, what we could be, and why we aren't what we claim to be. And they were not softballs. I mean, you can throw softballs as and call them truth. These were tough. For instance, let me just give you one example. One of the people I painted early on, who was not a 19th century figure, but extremely important to me, was Wendell Barry, who's a poet, novelist, essayist, and farmer from Kentucky, still alive, in his mid-80s now. One of the great people in the world, explaining what a land ethic should be, how we have to be in relationship to the world and to nature and to land if we're going to survive on this planet. And but the quote I put in his painting came from an essay he wrote at the end of what was called the First Gulf War in 1991, when the U.S. had invaded, Iraq had invaded Kuwait, and the United States had put together this coalition of countries to kick them out. I mean, that's a superficial explanation of what happened there. But Wendell Barry wrote this essay at the end of it. He said, this is what I put on his painting, the most alarming sign of the state of our country today is that our leaders have the courage to sacrifice the lives of young people in war, but not the courage to tell us to be less greedy and less wasteful. If you take a statement like that and, say, talk to high school kids and ask them, well, what's he talking about? Why does it take, what kind of courage does it take for a leader to sacrifice the lives of young people in war? I mean, is he being sardonic? Is he being cynical? What's he talking about? And then you say to them, well, what kind of courage would it take to tell us to be less greedy and less wasteful? And why has he put these two things together? I mean, really analyze that statement. It doesn't take long for any group of high school kids to figure out that there's a relationship between those two things. And finally, that the reason that leaders don't have the courage to demand that we be less wasteful and less greedy is because of economy. That we've built an economy based on waste and greed. And that the most sacred thing in our society is basically that economy and keeping it going. Maintaining the level of waste and greed that we have to keep it moving, the economy moving. And if that is the most important thing, then sacrificing the lives of your own children to keep it going, having the courage to sacrifice the lives of young people, is secondary. For some reason. It was finding quotes like that from people from all areas and walks of our lives, whether it's around economic issues, environmental issues, gender issues, women's issues, educational issues, workers' issues, you name it. Our society is full of people who've had the courage and perseverance to demand that we see a certain truth about what's going on and then live in accordance with that, and often stake their lives on doing that. And so this has been absolutely fascinating for me, to be identifying those people, some of those people, the thing is there are millions of them, and then honor them by trying to paint a portrait and then use the portrait in turn for education. And my life through the process has been absolutely changed by this. Both the process of the larger part of just making the portraits and doing educational work, but the other thing is meeting the people I've painted. I've painted now over 230 portraits, the goal being 50. It's an obsessive compulsive disorder at this point. I mean, I just can't stop because it's so interesting. I keep hearing about and meeting people who are doing amazing things. And some of them have become such great friends that I want to keep doing things with them, which is fascinating. I went to Rwanda with an artist named Lily Ye to work in the village of survivors of genocide and use art to rebuild community. I again went with her to Palestine to work with in refugee camps in the West Bank, also using art to rebuild community. I get to spend a lot of time with some of the most courageous people in our culture today who are whistleblowers around all sorts of governmental, intelligence, corporate organizations. And it's interesting. I mean, these are often the people inside organizations and systems and government who are initially the most patriotic, the most idealistic. And then when they see corruption, they think that they've discovered it and everybody's going to want to know and change because of it. Little do they know that the system and the people who run the system know very well what's going on, and they're profiting by it and will actually try to crush the whistleblower when he or she tries to tell what's really going on. These are often turn out to be absolutely fascinating people about how they stand up to that stress and how they continue to talk. Anyway, there's so many realms of what's happening today and the people who struggle against it and the people who find community and meaning and joy in their lives by doing that work. You know, I think a lot of people think that doing political activism is unfulfilling, tough, kind of driven work, and it's just the opposite in a way. I mean, it is often very hard because success is tough, but the communities of people who are involved in the work are wonderful people and full of great life and spirituality and meaning and fun. One of the people I painted, who is probably one of the best known, because I've discovered that most of the people I paint are not well known, even the people that should be, is a world figure, Helen Keller. And most people know her as the person who did so much about awakening people to disabilities, people with disabilities, and beginning a movement for disability rights. Changed consciousness, she really changed the consciousness of how people think, which is one of the things that everybody wants to do. But anyway, the quote that's on her painting, I think, is one of the most significant in the whole Americans Who Tell the Truth series now. And she said, when you come to think of it, there are no such things as divine, immutable, or inalienable rights. She was basically saying that our Declaration of Independence is wrong. We don't really have these things. We don't have these inalienable rights. What she says, when you come to think of it, there are no such things as divine, immutable, or inalienable rights. Rights are things you get when you have the strength to make good your claim on them. That is profound about what it means to be, an agent in a democratic society. That, we aren't just born with these things. We like to think that, but we're not. We have these rights because we struggle for them. And in one sense, that sounds, oh my gosh, I got to work even harder now. We got this big fight. But no, it's an enormous opportunity. We know that we can achieve these goals, make sure that not just we have rights, but other people have rights, or at least have the opportunity to have rights, if we persevere, if we have courage, that we can do this. And people have done it, and that's the great lesson of all these paintings too. People have done this, we have succeeded in getting more civil rights, in ending Jim Crow, in ending lynching, in giving workers' rights, in ending child labor, in giving women's rights. These things all happened. And they happened not easily, but with struggle by people who understood that they would have no rights unless they claimed them. Helen Keller understood that. We all can understand that. If we understand that deeply enough, we can transform this world.
Robert, thank you so much for this conversation and for all your incredible work in the world.
Thank you. I'm just keeping myself alive.
Thanks again, Robert.
Yeah, thank you.
Hello, Rory here again. If you like this interview, can you please help let others know about it by sharing it on social media and wherever you can? There are lots more great interviews in the archive, so check them out if you haven't heard them already, and there are lots more in the pipeline. If you want to help sustain and grow this podcast and be part of the Love and Courage community, you can become a once-off or a monthly patron by chipping in online at loveandcourage.org, and feel free to drop me an email anytime to podcast@loveandcourage.org. Thanks so much for all your support. It really makes a big difference. And here's to you and to your courageous journey in the world. Until next time.